Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the SLS series brought to you by Sustainable Stories Africa. Today, we'll be moving out of Nigeria, our comfort place, and we'll be going to the eastern part of Africa, where we'll be speaking to the Malawian engineer who is powering rural Africa energy future, one village mini grid at a time. Her name is Tombo Banda, the managing director of CrossBoundary's mini grid innovation. Hi, Tombo. It's a pleasure to speak with you. You are the first guest we have featured from outside Nigeria in this series, and we're delighted to have you represent East Africa. Our platform is Nigerian-based, but African-focused, because we believe Africans must tell our own story with an understanding of the continent's cultural diversity, context, and priorities.
Thank you as well. Yeah, I'm excited to, represent the region. There's a lot happening in East Africa, so it's great to be able to speak to some of that.
So Tombo, let's start. The apprentice on the rounds. You grew up accompanying your father, an engineer, to visit plants, infrastructure sites. Engineering was therefore never abstract to you. Looking back on those early experiences and later working with him, how did they shape your journey from technical design to a broader commitment to making a difference?
Okay, so I think, I'll start by saying, having my dad as an engineer really informed my worldview in terms of that, as an individual, you have the capability of making very tangible impact in people's lives through what you design and what you build. And I like the point that you made around, engineering not being an abstract concept, because I was really able to see that from a very young age, and understand that, when you open a tap and water comes out, there's a whole infrastructure outlay behind that. There's a whole investment that's been made for that. So, when I would go with my dad to visit, one of the dams, it's like, okay, this is the river that feeds into the dams. This is the water treatment system. These are the pumps that now pump to the city. Through these pipes, the water is now making its way into people's houses. So you're having that very real view of, what it takes to, supply services to an individual was quite tangible from a young age. And because I knew that, I knew the contrast of that, right? The opposite of that. So I was lucky in the sense that I was privileged from a relatively, so I have a middle-class background. Growing up in town, we had, piped water, we had electricity. But when I would go to my grandma's house, for example, when I was very young, it did not have piped water and it did not have electricity. So what did that mean? It meant, we had to go and fetch water, literally. And then at night, it was, kerosene lamps and whatnot. So I really knew what the counterfactual was to not having that infrastructure and the very real impact it had on people's lives and livelihoods, the toll it took, the limitations of that. And, I saw engineering as a way to, solve these problems and contribute to, alleviating some of these challenges that I knew were solvable through engineering. And I think I really have my dad to thank for that.
A huge part of your journey is what you call Salima as a proof of concept. Let us turn to Salima and the Malawi Mango processing factory. It was a formative experience at the intersection of infrastructure, jobs, and community development. What did it teach you about building financial and sustaining development? Financing and sustaining development, sorry.
So I think the Malawi Mangoes project was really a pivotal moment in my career, because it brought together so many different elements of engineering, finance, impact. And I really saw, I saw what it takes to bring something from concept to reality. So, you've conceived an idea, you have a business plan, you raise money for that, then you actually have to put those plans into practice. What does it take to do that? Coordinating across suppliers, engineers, human resources people, whatever it may be, it's a whole big operation that goes to bringing that thing into reality. And I was really lucky to have the opportunity to sort of work on from the center of that from an engineering perspective. But I think, more broadly, what I saw is that, an investment like that can really transform communities. So, with the creation of that factory, came the creation of jobs. So, jobs in the factory itself, jobs in the farm, jobs in the sort of wider ecosystem of the community where we situated this factory in Salima. So that was, local hotels, local caterers, local suppliers, had this new group of people who are now working at this factory who could, buy their goods and services. Even suppliers for the factory itself were sourced from within the community. So I really saw how sort of industry can transform a community's economic outlook. And, in that case, it wasn't really a case of, bringing electricity to this community. This community was actually already electrified, but it was a case of bringing, technology processing to that community. So yes, in summary, it's this whole thing of how sort of investment and making that a reality can impact communities, but also on the flip side, how ultimately, external infrastructure and logistics can really hamper those efforts. So in this specific example of the Salima Malawi Mangoes factory, at the time, it was located next to a railway station to make ease of logistics, for the product to get to market. But the rail never really came. The trains themselves never really came through and materialized as they were supposed to. The outages of electricity from the main utility were such that, the company ended up spending a lot of diesel, because they had put out an outlay already on the plant and machinery. It was, expensive for them to add solar, so the diesel was the backup. And, that ended up being a cost. So, all of these factors, the infrastructure, the logistics, meant it was so much harder to keep that product competitive, with international products of similar nature. So, I also saw how, these external factors can also impact the best laid plans in terms of, you might get everything right on paper, your engineering, your plans, but, these external factors can really ruin, what can be so beneficial to the community. So I think really that's some of the learnings I took from that experience.
You're an engineer by training. However, from an engineer, you went in to become an investor. You went from engineering at Imperial College to a master's in engineering in sustainable development at Cambridge. Then to McKinsey, where you advised governments on multi-billion-dollar public investment. What moved you from building infrastructure to helping decide what infrastructure gets built?
So I think, going back to that transition and what I learned from the two different institutions, I think I came away from Imperial with a very strong sort of technical background, right? So I knew how to design, price, and execute projects. Through the work experience that followed, I knew a bit more about, okay, how these external factors, need to be taken into account, even in an engineering context. And I think when I went to Cambridge, what I learned on top of that was to really apply a systems approach across everything, right? So thinking across the infrastructure, investment, development, and thinking through, what are the options around that, that give you adaptability, that deal with uncertainty, that allow you to build in a modular sense, that are irreversible, so that, as you think through development, you're not making these mistakes, right? So it's not really about just what gets built versus what doesn't get built. It's like, what are the various options? If you build, do you build like this? If you don't build, what are the trade-offs? So, that kind of systems thinking gives you this very pragmatic view and a framework to kind of think through sort of these wider questions on a systems level, on a national level, on a regional level, that affects multiple governments, multiple countries and jurisdictions, and allows you to make decisions based on that and future outlook. So more and more on a macro level than when I was thinking on a very sort of project specific level. I think that's the biggest thing I learned. And I think one of the most powerful things I learned in terms of, what gets built and what doesn't get built is, ESG is it's a very, I wouldn't say a high level concept, but it's a very sort of a woo-woo tree hugging concept to many people, right? They think of it as a nice to have a CSR thing for companies, and they don't really think about it in terms of, financial impact and numbers. And I think, what I learned, from Cambridge and subsequently in my McKinsey experience is, that ability to sort of apply an economic view to everything, so to price everything. If you're able to assign numbers to social impact, environmental impact, that's something that investors can understand. That's something that everyone can understand, actually. So, if I go and tell the man on the street that, hey, if I build this pipeline from the port into the city, your fuel cost will go up by 2 cents, but your insurance cost for your house down the road might go up by 5%, right? Because we're using more fossil fuels. It's a convoluted example, but that's kind of the trade-off that anyone can make when presented with numbers. So I think, being able to quantify the costs of resilience, infrastructure, the costs of insurance, when we think about what gets built versus what doesn't, is a really powerful tool when you're trying to think about incorporating sort of ESG into everyday infrastructure projects at large. So yeah, essentially, if you're able to do that, then you can turn investment into something that is digestible and tangible rather than just making it about, oh, tree hugging, oh, it's good for the environment. You have to present a financial case.
A huge part of this journey is you being able to make mini grids investable. You've worked on the mini grid business model for 5 years, including the CrossBoundary Mini Grid Innovation Lab, Africa's first R&D fund dedicated to testing mini grid models. Where is the investment case? Where is the investment case still most difficult, particularly for capital markets, and what will it take for private investors to see the hundreds of millions of Africans without reliable power as an opportunity rather than a risk?
So, yeah, I think, I've had the privilege, I'd say, of working on the mini grid business model for the last 5 years. It means a lot to me because, I've seen really the transformative power of electricity in households, for businesses, for communities. So I'm excited to be working on a problem that, helps, more investment being driven into this sector. I would say over the 5 years that I've been working in this space, we've done a lot of work to optimize around the business model. So, we really look at, what are those innovations that can reduce cost? What are those innovations that can improve revenue? And, on the cost side, I would say we have a really good understanding of, how to build mini grids in a modular fashion. So, really getting the sort of minimum size of PV and BESS that you need to serve like the big businesses or the anchor loads in the community. How do you combine that with, mesh grid solutions, battery rentals to, supply electricity, basic electricity to those households that are not consuming much yet? So, on the technology side, a lot of innovation has been done there. And, also the cost of PV and BESS has come down considerably, right? So that also helps. Then on the business model side, I would say there's a really strong understanding that, those who have income generating businesses, if they can be, given machinery that can run on the mini grid, this can, significantly increase revenues. So, capturing productive use of energy across these communities, whether it's agro processing or carpentry, bars, hair salons, starting new enterprises, whatever it is that you can do to drive consumption on the mini grid through machinery and electrically powered appliances really, improves that business case. So, I think, we've optimized on the cost side, we've optimized on the business model side. We've also looked at, how different tariffs can impact your consumption. So at lower tariffs, you expect, higher consumption for some customer segments. And we have a good understanding of that. And, you can, put tariffs to incentivize, types of use. So, cooking or time of use, whether you want milling to happen in the afternoon versus at peak hour. So, there's a lot of understanding around the business model side of mini grids and the technology side of mini grids, to the extent to which I think we can actually deliver mini grids today, at 12% IRR, which would be comparable to other infrastructure projects. But, having said all that, one sort of persistent fundamental barrier remains. And, ultimately it's that, these rural households that we're serving just do not consume enough, right? So they are consuming, 3 to 6 kilowatt hours per month, if that on average, across many of the thousands of mini grids that already exist, which is just, too low. Even if you are balancing this across productive use customers, they will cross-subsidize. But really fundamentally, we want to have a developed rural customer that is able to consume a reasonable amount of power to make this business case more investable and more of an opportunity. So, what does that really mean? I think, this circles back to my earlier comments around sort of systems thinking. This is where we really need the governments of, our countries to come into play. To have a developed rural customer, if they are a farmer, which the majority of these guys are, you need to make sure they're getting, access to affordable agricultural inputs. You need to make sure that when they produce those inputs, they can, process them and get them to market. Getting things to market is really not as simple as it should be. Transport costs are ridiculously high. It comes back to basic infrastructure, such as roads. Do they have roads to take their goods from the village to the urban center? What is the cost to get them there? If it is prohibitive, it's already restrictive to the customer, right? They're not making any more money. They're not a strong rural customer. So we really need our governments to, come around with this supporting infrastructure that helps develop that rural customer. And, only ultimately then will we really see that investment come into the sector. In absence of that, or I guess in parallel to that, since, we have to be practical, we can't just wait for government. I think subsidies still plug this gap, and subsidies will remain a part of the story as they are for utilities everywhere in the developed world and here, right? So subsidies will remain a significant part of that story. But that will reduce as that rural customer becomes more and more developed and able to consume electricity at the rate that we would expect from emerging market or a developed market. So yeah, I think really those are the two gaps that we are trying to work on now. So thinking through how to develop that rural customer further, thinking through some of the outstanding challenges remaining around scaling productive use of energy, also providing healthcare electrification, also providing electricity to humanitarian settlements, refugee camps. So we're looking at some of those other issues that are persisting around energy access. But ultimately, that question lies at the fore. And we'll, invite, governments to work with us, and also citizens to hold their governments accountable, right? At the end of the day, we have to hold our governments accountable. If governments are not bringing roads, if governments are not, providing you with access to finance, at some point it's up to us to vote them out or hold them accountable. And if we're not doing that, this problem will persist, and then we'll be relying on external subsidies, etc., to get the 500, 600 million plus people without electricity to get connected.
A huge part of your journey is looking at infrastructure with people at its center. Today, Africa is moving towards an electric future. As you begin to work in the EV sector, what is the most important lesson you want the next generation of African engineers to carry forward about responsible infrastructure?
Yeah, so I think this next generation of engineers really needs to put people at the center of whatever it is they are designing, building, thinking about investing in. And I think by putting people at the center, you answer all of these questions. The economic question actually comes number one, right? How is this thing I am proposing going to improve this person's life economically first? Improve their lives, health-wise, how will just improve their general standard of living and quality of life. If we're thinking about all these things, then the interventions that we design and put in place will ultimately help our communities excel, right? So, when I think about the EV sector, which is the next sector that I'm working in, it's like, how does installing electric charging infrastructure for battery swaps for boda boda riders. We call them bodabodas here. I don't know what you call them in
All
Nigeria.
them
The
Okadas in
motorcycle.
Nigeria.
Yes. So how does this electric solution actually save the riders' cost on fuel, on energy, right? Is it reducing it? Are they taking more at home? What's the implication of that on their family? How does this new EV sector coming online impact the existing auto industry and the infrastructure around that? Will mechanics be able to transition from ICE to EV? What's the balance of jobs? What's the trade-off there? What are the clean energy sources to charge these these electric two-wheelers? So, it's always thinking about, the balance around those factors on an individual level. Then you can take it to a macro level. What does the impact of EV infrastructure and increase in electronic vehicles, how does that impact the balance of payments of our countries, right? If they have a reduced oil bill, they suddenly have much more forex to spend on something else. What are the wider system effects of that? So, having, people at the center of whatever we're thinking about and designing for will, I believe, really help us come up with infrastructure and projects that, help, develop and take us to the next level in an inclusive way. So, projects that I despise are projects such as building mini grids for Bitcoin mining. Like, I hate that. I think it's like zero utility. You're doing something to produce a good that isn't even real and will not even be, of any value to someone on the ground. So I would really encourage us to use our brain power on these projects that put people at the center. Doesn't mean you can't make money, you really can. But let's develop our countries in a way that is, inclusive and, on balance, thinks about the wider community.
We're gradually coming to an end of this interview. But before you go, what phrase captures Tombo Banda's journey through engineering, investing, and building Africa's decentralized energy future?
I was thinking of 3 Ps, but I can't think of what the third P would be. I want to say people, passion, progress. Shout out to Sustainable Leadership Series. Thanks for checking me out and making these stories come to the fore. They're so important for all of us, and you're doing a great job.
We've been speaking to the Malawian engineer who has turned into an investor building mini grids across Africa's future. Her name, Tombo Banda. It's been a pleasure speaking to Tombo over the last 20-25 minutes, sharing her insights, her views about how she moved from engineering into financing and trying to build the next generation of sustainable energy across Africa, not just because she wants to build mini grids, but to create the future that would provide light to over 600 million Africans who have limited access to electricity. Tombo, thank you for speaking with us and do have a great time.